The Pedro Gorino, The Adventures of a Negro Sea Captain in Africa and on the Seven Seas, in his attempts to found an Ethiopian empire. An autobiographical narrative by Captain Harry Dean. Chapter 1. My ancestors were seafaring men. In the year 1737, when the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea were infested by pirates, there was a pirate ship wrecked off the northwest coast of Africa, near the Rio de Oro, and all the crew were lost, save the captain, McKinnon Page. The only survivor owed his life to a young native, Said Kafu, who, with the assistance of his people, cared for the captain many weeks. After the recovery of Page, when he had devised a plan whereby he could recover some of the treasure he had buried in Madeira, he induced the young native who had saved his life to accompany him. This boy, being of an adventurous nature, with a great desire to see the world, readily accepted and accompanied the pirate to Funchal, Madeira, where they recovered and buried doubloons and sovereigns. The town itself was quiet, with picturesque streets, a great fort, monasteries, and churches that had been built before the time of Columbus. As Said Kafu wrote many years later, with such verdure and bright weather as one may find at Funchal, is it great wonder that even the Roman patricians were constantly voyaging thither. Women were busy with their lace, while the men made wine from the grapes harvested in the vineyards that covered the steep slopes of the island. One would scarcely realize that this place was the rendezvous of pirates. However, 500 feet below, down the steep streets leading to the bay, one might have seen a motley crew from all nations. In that dirty, wild, lively Crescent Bay were ships of every variety, for here was Freeport and free anchorage. McKinnon Page was a Scotchman, and crafty as a fox. He knew his danger now he had no ship. Some few people knew him, and among them were men who would have betrayed him. He and the boy haunted the dens along the waterfront seeking passage to England. They carried their swords at their sides, for there were feuds among some of the grandees of Funchal, often rekindled in the resorts of the seamen. They might have been delayed some weeks had not Page luckily run across an old mate who had given up the pirate business to become an operator of ships. When at last they were aboard ship, plowing northward through the rough Atlantic, they were able to draw breath easily again. The ship stopped at Oporto to take on a cargo of port wine, then up anchor and was on its way again. Crossing the Bay of Biscay, a storm arose. Ships were badly made in those days, and the one on which Page and Said Kafu had taken passage tossed and pitched, creaking in every joint. They weathered the storm, however, and in due time entered the Channel. Until they reached the Thames, there was little to see except the numerous sailing vessels. Once at the mouth of the Thames, they took a pilot and made their way through the bustling life up to within 3 miles of London. McKinnon Page was a pirate, but a gentleman. He was devoted to Said Kafu and never deserted the trust. He was grateful to the boy for having saved his life, and in the years of their friendship that followed, he never once betrayed him. Page changed his name to Slocum, Captain Slocum. He changed the boy's to Sam Shoof. The pirate's bravado air, fine clothes, silver buckles, and liberal wealth cut a swath with English society. Many a lovely girl, seeing him on the streets of London or at the gala occasions, fell in love with him. The slim Mandingo boy, attired in the finest Arabian costume, accompanied the pirate, and added not a little to the glamour and mystery. Sam Kufi had learned only a few words of English, but his erect bearing and great devotion to Captain Slocum made the two an object of attention wherever they went. Whether or not Slocum was in real danger is a question. Certainly he had heard rumors that his real identity was known, and being fearful for his life and the life of the boy, he planned to flee England. They packed their clothes and their gold in a big sea chest and took passage for the American colonies. In the spring of the year 1740, they landed at Salem, Massachusetts. The creeks were running. The cherry and apple orchards covered the hilly countryside with bloom. On the rocky coast, all along the narrow sand beaches, the rollers from old storms spent their last force. Captain Slocum and Sam Coof liked the country well. The older man thought it would be profitable to start a ship chandler's outfit and sell to the many vessels coming to port everything that can make a ship seaworthy. So they settled farther down the coast at New Bedford and opened shop. Slocum was a roving spirit. He was continually on the go, aboard some whaler or coastwise freighter. It was his very life. But Sam Coffey, partner in the new business, stayed conscientiously at home on the job. Slocum was a gentleman and a scholar. Once free from the pirate life, he never went back. He became an important and respectable New Englander. His keen eye for business never led him into cheating his customers. During the winter months, when he was not so anxious to be on the sea, and business at New Bedford was slow, he spent many hours with Sam Coofy, teaching him all the arts and sciences he knew. When the boy was old enough to have a wife, the old pirate was equal to the occasion. He had seen a fine young Negro girl of the Kabyle tribe farther down the New England coast, and he brought her home with him one day aboard his ship. Sam and the girl fell in love at the first meeting, and before the spring had passed, the two were married. Captain Slocum had been a true friend, although he could have sold Sam into slavery anywhere in New England. He never did. Instead, he not only had made the boy his partner, educated him, and found him a wife, but now that Sam was married, and it was even more important to keep him safe, he bought land on the island of Cuttyhunk and gave it to the young couple. He once wrote of the boy, "He's a fine lad, aye, bright as a sovereign." The pirate, being a Scotchman, was an expert shipbuilder. He conceived the idea of starting a small shipyard at Cuttyhunk, and he and Sam went to work on their new project. They took great pride in their craft, and the ships they built went out to every port in the world. It was in these days that a new type of ship, the schooner, was being evolved on the American coast. The little shipyard worked early and late on orders of the new type. When the first schooner was launched, they felt a just pride. From slim masts and new white canvas to oaken keel, the boat was all they had dreamed it would be. During their career as shipbuilders, they made several important innovations in rigging. Most of the changes were toward greater simplicity. They experimented with the bowsprit, making many delicate adjustments. They improved the system of shrouding a vessel. Their method of stabilizing craft was contribution to the science of the day. There, on the cold, wave-swept New England island, Sam Cuffey and his young wife raised their family. 4 boys and 10 girls were born to the pair. The boys grew up to help their father with his business in his older years. The girls married into free Negro families along the coast, but these children were born into a world that misunderstood their position in life and treated them with a disrespect that was not their due. Maritime people are aristocrats wherever they go. The discipline and training of the sea endows men with unquenchable courage, and these free New England Negroes were as fearless seamen and as aristocratic in bearing as any Nordic you may offer. In the year 1772, Sam Cuffey died of pneumonia. Paul, his 4th and youngest son, then but 13 years of age, was to carry his father's name proudly to many countries. As the boy grew, he felt more and more strongly the unjust prejudice against his race. There were no public schools where he could obtain an education, and because of his color, he was barred from the private schools. Consequently, he educated himself. When he grew to be a man, the thought of his bitter youth still rankled within him, and he decided that as far as it was within his power, he would make it easier for the children of the next generation. About the year 1781, he set the example for Massachusetts by building a public school at his own expense on Cuttyhunk Island and inviting all children, both colored and white, to attend. They came from as far as New Brunswick on the north and New York on the south. Like his father, Paul was a shipbuilder. One of his dreams was to build a ship faster than any on the Atlantic. All his ability went into designing the Traveler, and she was one of the fastest sailing ships afloat. Officially, she was a brig, but the genius of Captain Paul Cuffey gave her a unique, elaborate rigging. On every boat he commanded, he taught the crew all the arts and sciences he knew. A great part of his life was spent trying to help those who had not had his opportunities. But although he was a friend to those who would be his friends, he was a splendid warrior when he sensed intolerance. On one occasion early in his life, when he found that because of his color he was not to be allowed to vote, he refused to pay his taxes, and because of the principle at stake, stubbornly continued to refuse until he was at last thrown into prison. Paul Cuffey was the first Negro to petition the powers that be in regard to slavery. His document was addressed to the legislature of New Jersey, asking that body to petition the Congress of the United States that every slave be freed, and that every colored man that so desired be allowed to leave America. This petition was one of the first bits of motivation in a controversy which still rages. It subsequently led to the founding of the American Colonization Society. Before the War of 1812, he had outfitted his brig, the Traveler, and sailed it to Norway, Russia, Denmark, England, and France. He had circumnavigated Africa, investigating its shores to discover the best place to found a national home for freed slaves. Having finally decided on the Cape of Good Hope, he returned to England, where he obtained the cooperation and enthusiastic assistance of Bishop Wilberforce Clarkson, the great abolitionist, the Duke of Portland, and several other noblemen. These humanitarians arranged to secure the means to pay the Southern planters the price of their slaves. The cooperation of the British government was obtained, whereby they were to purchase the British territory of the Cape of Good Hope. Paul was to transport those who would be free to their new national home, but the slaves and the pro-slave element in England, America, France, Spain, Portugal, and the islands were sufficiently strong to defeat the great Negro both at home and abroad. When the War of 1812 broke out, Paul Cuffey was again on the sea. He was encountered by an English gunboat. Since his brig was unarmed and the sea was crowded with his enemies, he thought it best to submit peacefully to arrest. When he was brought into port, Wilberforce and others heard of his plight and had him released. Only a few weeks later, through the machinations of the Americas, who hated him, he was again arrested, this time by ships of his own government. Had he not been a friend of President Madison, his ship might have been tied up indefinitely. Madison knew Cuffey's quest, however, and was able to secure his release. It was during these harassing days that Cuffey decided to hit the first physical blow at slavery. From all along the Atlantic seaboard, he gathered a little band of free Negroes who were with him heart and soul in his colonization project. He then dropped anchor in New York Harbor, armed and provisioned his boat, and prepared for a bolder stroke. The mother of John Kensel, one of the boys and his crew, was a slave on a South Carolina plantation. Cuffey determined to free her and slipped southward for that purpose. When they had anchored off the Carolina shore, he decided to free not only the mother of John Kensel, but every slave on the plantation. Leading his crew of 18 Huskies ashore, he freed the overjoyed slaves, burned their miserable huts, and put to sea. The glow from the fires shone on the dark water. By morning they were far out on the Atlantic. The Traveler headed straight for West Africa, and made the trip in record time. There were, besides the captain and crew, 12 slaves taken from the plantation, and the free Negroes he had picked up along the coast. He landed them on the coast of Sierra Leone, at Freetown, West Africa. Paul Cuffey had given these people all he had. It was necessary to go to England for funds and provisions. Consequently, he left the colony in the hands of John Kensel and Frank James, and sailed northward. But Governor McCarthy, governor of Sierra Leone, was as heartless as many of his successors, a true imperialist. He drove these people away. They would have perished, but were rescued by Lieutenant Stockton of the United States Navy, who assisted them down to the coast to a little raised island in the mouth of the Masarata River, where they founded the colony that later became the Republic of Liberia. Meanwhile, the sisters and brothers of Paul Cuffey had scattered all over the world. Paul himself, having married a girl in New Bedford, had raised a family of 3 girls and 4 boys. His youngest son, John Cuffey, like his father and grandfather, was well educated. On June 5, 1817, a letter directed to Paul Cuffey asked the old captain his advice in the choice of a school teacher for a secret school for Negro children to be founded in Charleston, South Carolina. Cuffey realized the great danger, but sent his son John. The older man knew the boy might be apprehended anywhere along the way, tried, and sold into slavery. But his heart was with his race, and he told the boy to go. In attempting to get to his destination via the Underground Railroad, John was betrayed. He sent this short letter to his father: York Jail, January 13, 1818. Dear Father, this is to inform thee that in my journey to Alexandria I have been apprehended and confined in prison for an impostor. They say I am not your son, and for that reason I wish thee to come on immediately, or send some of the neighbors, and by that means I can get released from this place. The 2 men that had me taken are named Jonathan Jessup and Amos Gilbert, 2 friends, both residing in this place. They say that I must prove that I am thy son, or else I must stand trial at the next court, which is April. This from thy son, John Cuffey. The name of the place is Little York, Pennsylvania, about 90 miles from Philadelphia. The letter must have reached Paul Cuffey as he was dying. Help was slow in coming, and John was in jail many weeks. It is unknown how he escaped, but one of his later letters tells how he hid days and traveled nights, finally arriving at Marietta, Ohio. Here he was given asylum by a group of abolitionists. This was dreamy country. He had been promised safety and the fertile fields, lush meadows, and gently rolling country. All held him with their spell. He forgot his goal in South Carolina, as any other boy of 20 might have done. Only occasionally did he think of the sea and the wild New England coast. Soon he married and took a little farm. To John Cuffey and his wife was born one child, Susan Cuffey, great-granddaughter of Sam Cuffey. She was a mild-natured little girl, fond of her books and the quiet life about their home. When she grew up, she married a Mr. Shepherd, who took her to live with him in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He died shortly, leaving her with one child. Here she met John Dean, son of a wealthy Philadelphia merchant, who fell in love with her. They were married and went to live in Philadelphia. John Dean's family had come from Quetta, Morocco. For 3 generations they had been wealthy merchants of Philadelphia. During colonial times, they were under the protection of the British and Portuguese governments, and after the United States became a free country, they continued in their business. Of this union of Susan Cuffey and John Dean, I, Captain Harry Dean, was born November 20th, 1864. Chapter 2. I Go to Sea. There were 18 children in my family, 7 boys and 11 girls. I was the youngest boy. Of that family, only 3 of us are now alive: Alice, Mamie, and I. I am an African and proud of it. There is not a drop of white blood in my veins. My ancestors have been sea captains and merchants, and I have spent my life on the sea. My father was a tall, proud, not very religious, but kindly sort of man. My mother was a fine singer, and a cultured and idealistic woman. I hope I have proved worthy of them. While I was still a boy, I was given copies of Horace, Homer, Virgil, Petrarch, Shakespeare, Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, a translation of the Arabian Chronicles, Arabian Nights, Colonel George Williams' History of the Negro, a hand-illumined Spirit of the Laws, and many others. Mother delighted in training us, and when I was old enough she put me under the tutelage of Fanny Jackson, the great Negro woman educator, at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. Here I was taught grammar, arithmetic, and a foundation in the 5 natural sciences. Everything theoretical, nothing practical. I lived such a sheltered life that I became idealistic. I was entirely unaware of the race problem. I knew nothing of the hardships and treacheries of life. We had all the money we needed, and I knew nothing of poverty. Since that time, I have experienced all the hardships known to man. Often we had visitors, Major Martin R. Delaney, Major in the Union Army during the Civil War, United States Senator Revels, and General Belaski, an escaped rebel officer from Cuba, were among the most frequent. I remember General Belaski in particular. He was as black as pitch, and as far across as he was tall. He told me stories of the Cuban Rebellion in his mild voice. I come from salt water, sunny land alive, should see them islands, and see the sea a-swishin' on the shore, should see them black boys, sunny creepin' on their bellies through the brush. Guns no good, clothes all ragged, but filled with the Spirit, and not afraid of the devil himself. It was music to my young ears. I could have listened forever. Besides these few celebrities, there were many fine neighbors, particularly the Mintons, Wares, Fortunes, and Dutrells, a strange class of people whose history has never been written. They were, for the most part, of maritime ancestors, and had become enmeshed in the devastating American environment only after generations of protest. We kept in close contact with these people, for they were the few who could understand our aims and ideals. The summer I was 12, we went as usual to our cottage at Atlantic City. I swam in the sea and played on the beaches in the sunshine. Some days my father would let me ride in the little 20-ton schooners, whose business it was to carry any who chose to the horizon and back for 25 cents. Suddenly, I was crazy to go to sea. The salty tang in the air, and rough sailors, the glamour about boats, the stories of adventure I had heard all through my childhood, filled me with a tremendous urge. I thought of the sea night and day. On returning to Philadelphia, we found my Uncle Silius, an honest-to-goodness sea captain, come to stay with us for a few days. He was preparing to make a 3-year voyage around the world aboard his ship, Traveler II. He was, therefore, a hero. He was a man of splendid physique, rapid in his movements, and a true sea captain. He had a terrible stare. I was never sure when he looked at me whether he was angry or not. If he had not been my uncle, I should have been afraid of him. but his stories were as rich and fabulous as those of Sinbad the sailor. One evening, as we sat at supper, he said to my father, "John, I can tell by the cut of his jib the boy would make a good sailor. He'd reef and furl in no time, and I'd have him boxing the compass and shooting the sun before we got around the Horn. Why not let me take him along?" It seemed as if whole minutes passed before my father answered, and when he did I hung on every word. "Would you take good care of him, Silius? Bring him back ship-shape, or my name's not Dean," my uncle answered. "The sea's a rough place for a boy. There's nothing like the sea to test what's in a boy. It would make a man of him, John." "I'll have to think it out," my father said. "Give me till morning." He seemed worried that evening. Mother cried a little, but with all the thoughtlessness of youth, I was hardly aware of their sorrow. It was more miraculous than my Arabian Nights. They must let me go. I knew they would. But why did I have to wait until morning to be sure? My brain was whirling with excitement and emotion. Morning came at last. I could go. "Ah, Christophe, toisant l'ouverture." Strong men of my race, were you as exultant in your power as I in mine upon that happy morning? In my imagination I already ruled the seas. I had a fleet of ships, their white sails filled with wind, but little did I realize the hardships of the sea, or the hard life that awaited me, and little did I realize the impotence of a child of 12. My uncle and I took a train from Philadelphia and landed at Jersey City late at night. We went from the station to the ferry landing, and for the first time I saw the lights of New York, the way they were reflected on the dark waters of the Hudson stays with me all these years. Then aboard the ferry boat, everywhere there was the bustle of boats, horns blowing, and men calling over water. Having lived in the quiet city of Philadelphia all my life, I had never seen anything like this wild, tumultuous life. We landed at wooden docks that thronged with rough, dirty, barefoot boys selling newspapers, sleeping in out-of-the-way corners, fighting for no apparent reason. It was an Irish part of town, crowded with sailors and toughs. Uncle Silius pushed and crowded, pulling me along by the hand. We passed along narrow streets and between high brick buildings until we came to Minetta Lane. Squalid enough today, but respectable then. Here we put up for the night with an aunt who made a great fuss over me. "Honey Chile, let me give you one mo cake." The next morning we went down to the harbor, and for the first time I saw my uncle's ship, Traveller II. I liked the smell of Stockholm tar. The way the sailing vessels floated and bobbed on the water was a mystery. The lines and the rigging of the ship impressed me and set me wondering. I remember the Traveller was a barkentine, with both square rig and fore and aft rig, a mixture of the two types of rigging. She carried studding booms for studding sails that bellied balloon-like on each side, so that to those on board and to those who saw her pass, she gave the impression of a seagull on the wing. She was very fast under full sail. There, on the docks at New York, were sailors from every country. Some of them were dressed in flannel shirts, as red as fire. Their great bulging muscles showed through their clothing. Where their sleeves were rolled up, their strong brown arms rippled like the surface of water in a breeze. The proportions of these men and their hoarse voices impressed me and made me wish I were as big and strong as they. Where will you find such men now? Gone are the sailing vessels, and gone the men who sailed them. They were a singing, laughing bunch in port, but let their ship get into rough weather, rounding the Horn, or off the Cape of Storms, up in the Gulf of Alaska, or wherever they were. Let the decks get icy, and the gale go whistling and moaning through the shrouds, and see if they weren't as true as steel. No grumbling or growling when the boatswain called, "All hands ahoy!" They're gone now, but there they were on the dock at New York and aboard the Traveler when I went to sea as a boy. Sometimes chanties came clearly over the water, one sailor singing a line, the crew answering, "Haul the bowline, the good ship's a-rolling. Haul the bowline, the bowline haul." Then before I could catch more, a dozen voices on the dock, laughing and shouting, would drown out the singing. "Give a hand there, man, and if the mate ain't 7 kinds of devil, I ain't never been in Cork. Shet your mouth, Folly, give a heave on that puncheon. Where's Mr. Watson? Oh, Mr. Watson." It was our men making the racket. They were loading the cargo of hardware, notions, bright cloth, beads, and trade goods of all kinds into puncheons, great barrel-like containers as tall as a man. They had been at the work for over a week. The Traveler had made her departure from Boston some 2 weeks before, dropped anchor at New York, and prepared to receive cargo. Uncle Silius had come to Philadelphia to get me, leaving the loading of the vessel in charge of the first mate. We had arrived in New York in time to see the last of that work. My uncle was talking to the first mate. "We'll muster the men this evening, Mr. Watson. See that they're aboard early. We'll up anchor at dawn." My uncle and I went aboard late that afternoon and made ourselves comfortable in his spacious cabin. What a great man I thought him, with his charts and sextants and compasses, his wealth of sea knowledge, and his exciting stories. Aboard ship, however, he had little time to play. His stern expression seldom relaxed into a smile, and although I admired and respected him, as did his sailors, I was a little in awe of this dark brown giant, whose word was law to so many men, and he was a man to inspire awe, courageous as every sea captain must be. I found in the days that followed that he was perfectly fearless and would never shorten sail until the decks were at an angle of 40 degrees. At dawn we made our departure from Red Bank. We might have been a phantom ship. We moved so gently over the ocean. The pale early morning light flooded the decks of the ship, where men moving at their work seemed scarcely men of this world. But as the breeze stiffened, and the sun rose higher, and the last mist of sleep cleared from before my eyes, I realized that we had put to sea, and that my life of adventure had begun. Because of my experiences on the small pleasure schooners, I felt myself quite a sailor. The commodious barkentine seemed perfectly safe in my young eyes. Everything was expectation. I wanted to see pirates and buried treasure. I wanted to lead a wild and gallant life. I did not realize how helpless I was, or how unprepared for the sea and the hardships of sailors. The crew was a mixed one. More than half of the men were Negroes. As they worked, they sang. For 7 long years I courted Sally. Way, roll, and go. The sweetest flower in all the valley. Spend my money on Sally Brown. How many times I was to hear that and similar songs, filled with the wailing rhythm of the African race. What is it you have lost? What have you left behind? What are you looking for, you unhappy hostages of an alien race? At Charleston, South Carolina, a colored pilot came out in a small sailing vessel and took us into port. That was the only colored pilot I ever saw in American waters. I remember my uncle had a lot of trouble in Charleston. There was an argument with a port official, of which I caught but little and understood less. "Ain't no nigga goin' run this port," the official shouted. And my uncle, in his quiet, cold voice, I merely asked for clearance papers and the usual civility shown a ship's officer. Whatever the trouble was, my uncle thought it necessary to admonish the crew not to leave the ship. He told them that the boat was to up anchor the minute the clearance papers were ready. Other crews swarmed all along the waterfront, but ours remained aboard the ship, sullen and angry. Each man felt that the indignity done the ship was a personal affront. My uncle and I went ashore, however. I accompanied him everywhere, particularly to the custom house. We were in Charleston over one Sunday. We went to church. The colored people were nice to us, but their dialect was so strange that I could scarcely understand them at times. At last we got our clearance papers and made our departure. We were no sooner out of the harbor than we ran into severe rain and hailstorms. The ship was fighting adverse winds and currents, and the hail set up a great tattoo on the deck. I was too young to realize our danger. The excitement was more or less pleasurable to me. That night was an anxious one for the crew and for my uncle. I could not understand the serious demeanor of the men. None of them would talk or laugh with me. Each hurried about the deck, doing his appointed task. Some clambered up the ratlines to reef sails. Some pulled and hauled on halyards. The mate's orders and the crew's, "Aye, aye, sir," were carried far out over the water by the storm. I heard their voices as if they had come from a great distance. Most of the crew were on deck all night, and although my uncle told me to go to my bunk in the cabin and get some sleep, I was unable to close my eyes. I was not afraid, but I was aware of a sinister foreboding. It was as if the sailors could sense something terrible and strange, something within the darkness which I could not see or hear or feel with my unaccustomed senses. Of course, the weather was dark and stormy, with black clouds hurrying across the flattened dome of heaven. But that alone was not enough to account for their actions. Their silence was more expressive than all the rough weather. Later in the night, the rain and hail let up, and I got out of my bunk to see how things were going on deck. At the door of the galley sat Johnson, a fine old man who was our cook and steward. He liked me a great deal, and always carried on an engaging conversation. Even he was still. He had been sitting there at the door of his galley all night. His pipe had long since gone out. When I spoke to him, he would only answer in monosyllables. The sea was running high, and white caps were breaking. The salt spray stung my face, and although I did not realize that we were on a lee shore, with a shifting wind and in great danger, I did know that I was lonesome and lost and very homesick. Chapter 3. We Round the Horn. The next morning the fog was so thick that we ran into one another on the deck. I bumped against the sailors moving about their work. The air was gradually warming, which was pleasing to me, as the night had been chilly. My uncle's voice boomed through the fog. "Square the main foresail." From everywhere about me the crew answered, "Aye, aye, the main foresail." My uncle kept telling the crew to put up this sail and that sail, until we were nothing but a mass of white sails. I do not know how long the fog lasted, but soon the sun was shining, and we were bowling along. We came without mishap to St. Augustine, and there we dropped anchor. This town was more quaint than any I had ever seen, old and picturesque. The thing that struck me was the sunlight on the old plaster buildings and the plains of light and shadow. That impression stays with me, although much else is forgotten. It was 50 years ago, when I was but a boy, and the trip is like a dream. I remember we left the ship in the harbor at St. Augustine and went overland to Jacksonville. My uncle wished to see several friends and do business there. I had never seen so many colored people. I remember the St. John's River at Jacksonville. It was not until I visited the west coast of Africa that I saw anything to surpass it. The next day we went aboard the ship at St. Augustine and made our departure. A stiff breeze carried us southward along the coast of Florida. Most of the time we were within sight of the sandy beach that looked in the bright sunlight like a white ribbon. At 4 bells in the morning, a few days later, we came into the Gulf of Mexico, and I saw that body of water for the first time. The mate, who was a Yankee, took a great delight in fishing. When we sailed into the Gulf, he took out his fish lines and began fishing off the taffrail. As he fished, he sang, "So let the waves go rolling, and let the wind go blow. A sailor man's a freeman, as only sailors know." He stopped abruptly, seeing me approach, fish line in hand. He asked me in his gruff voice, "Sonny, what you fishin' for, whale?" Then he laughed a great laugh, and went to singing again, hardly waiting for my answer, beginning his song where he had left off. "The town is neat and handy for girls and gaiety, but life is worth the living on the wide blue sea." He paid no attention to me at all, but continued to smoke and fish, occasionally bursting into song in his thunderous voice. I was not to be discouraged, however. After throwing out my line, I stood looking at the wake of the boat, and wondering what happened to waves when they disappeared, and wondering how it was that after a boat had gone by, the water got smooth again, so that you could not even see where it passed. Suddenly the line was almost jerked from my hands. I hung on with all my strength, and was almost pulled over the taffrail. I was so startled that I had no idea for a moment what had happened. I braced myself against the rail, and called loudly for help. The mate and others came to my assistance, and heaved away on the line. As they pulled, a great fish jumped out of the water. The sun struck his scales, making a gleaming silver halo about him. "Shiver my timbers if he ain't a silver king," said the mate, his voice betraying both admiration and envy. We pulled him aboard. He was a beauty, and weighed a little over 75 pounds. I was very proud. He was cooked for dinner, and the steward, old Johnson, gave me the first choice of the meat. It was the most delicious fish I've ever tasted. The weather was clear on the Gulf. The water was as blue as indigo, shading to green. The sky curved over us like a silver bell. When I went on deck each morning, I could hardly believe my senses. I did not want to take time to eat or sleep. I wanted to be everywhere all the time, seeing everything, doing everything, and missing nothing. The crew was a big one, and there was plenty of help. The watches were regular. There were none ill aboard ship at this time. The sailors were busy splicing ropes, making knots, weaving mats, carving ship models, and doing the 1,001 things sailors do in good weather. One man was painting pictures of the sea and of the ports we visited. Foley, an Irish-American with a slight brogue, was making corncob pipes. Like the rest of the crew, he wanted to teach me his handicraft. "I'll show ye how to make a pipe, as would satisfy the King of England himself." The bloody rascal. "Here, hold your knife so, scrape her smooth. When you get through doing that, you cut a little hole for the stem, so. There, you're catching on. You'll be making better pipes than old Foley himself, for we get around the horn." And then, when the lesson was over, he would say, "Sure, and you'll be a divil with the girls one of these fine days. There's fine brown girls in every port, as will be fallin' all over themselves, making eyes at ye. The best part o' goin' to sea is a goin' ashore on payday, but you're too young a lad to be thinkin' on them things." When we arrived at the mouth of the Mississippi River, we beat about for several hours, waiting for a pilot. It was early morning, and as the sun came higher and higher, we could see where the muddy water of the river hit the blue water of the Gulf. When the pilot finally came aboard, he took us to anchor near a bank overlooking a marshy flat. There were thousands of wild ducks and geese on the marsh. Some of them flew nearly over us, making a sharp whistling sound with their wings. We hitched to a tug later in the day. It pulled us off up the river toward New Orleans. We passed 2 forts that the sailors seemed to know about. This started tales of bloodshed and heroism, as some of the men had fought in the Civil War and were very bitter about it. Farther up the river, we saw an encampment of men, probably a gang of working on the levee. The war stories told by the sailors had excited my imagination to the point where I believed these gangs of workmen were rebel soldiers and that our ship, the Traveler, was a Union gunboat. The imaginary battle carried with it all the thrill of siege and all the glamour of victory. As we went up the river, the shores became greener. The trees had streamers of moss hanging from their branches. It was my first introduction to the subtropics, and the flora was unlike any I had known. When we finally got up to New Orleans, we went through locks into the heart of the city. What an attractive and busy place it was! There were ships and boats of all sorts. Great swarthy sailors ran up and down their decks. My uncle and I went ashore, and after walking a long time, we came to a low building where there were thousands of people trading. The many narrow stalls held merchandise of every variety. We stopped while he took care of some business. Then we walked up Canal Street, a street lined with stores and swarming with more kinds of people than I had ever seen. There were brown, black, yellow, and white people, all talking in different languages. After my uncle had transacted some business at the custom house, we went to my aunt's. She was a sister of my father and of Uncle Silas. She lived on a street called Elysian Fields. My aunt deserved a street with such a name. She was the kindest little lady I have ever met, and she took a liking to me from the first, although I was only 12 years old, and nowhere near my full growth. My aunt was so short that she only came up to my shoulder. She wore her hair in tight curls all over her head. There were great gold earrings in her pretty brown ears. Her silk skirts stood way out on each side and rustled when she walked. When she went out of doors, she put a bright shawl over her head. She would say, "Come here, child. Where'd you get dem big brown eyes? You am most delectable enough to eat. Better stay here with your po Aunt Sylvia. She'll feed you all the chicken you can eat. This am the promised land, child, the land of milk and honey. The sharks will get you if you go out to sea. Stay here in New Orleans by the big dreamy river." We were treated so well in New Orleans that we must have stayed a month or 6 weeks. We finally had to leave, however, so aboard the Traveler once more down the river and out into the Gulf. The weather was warm and dreamy. I lived the life of a young prince. We went down the coast to Galveston, then to Vera Cruz. I had read a book about the Mexicans while I was still a boy, and I watched them with interest at Vera Cruz. If I remember rightly, we went to the West Indies next, and traveled in and out among the islands, trading with the English. I remember we sighted Barbados on our starboard. My uncle told me that somewhere here on the sea floor lay the bones of Francis Drake, with the fish swimming over and the white sand beneath. Later we dropped anchor at Bridgetown and did some trading. We took on water at a little island where the people were all colored and all talked like Irishmen, which amused us greatly. Several big black fellows came aboard the ship and started chattering in a brogue as broad as you could find in Dublin. "Sure, and it's a foine ship ye got, Mr. Dean. It's been many a day since we've seen the likes of her in these waters." Folly was dozing in the forecastle. A half-dozen wags went to get him up. "Wake up, Folly. We just dropped anchor off the Emerald Isle. The skipper, he's been fooling us all this time, and here we are at Ireland. Your ma and pa is waiting for you on the dock." Poor Folly followed his tormentors to the deck, racking his sleepy brain in a vain effort to get his bearings. For one amazed and bewildered moment he stood and listened to the natives, Then grabbing a belaying pin, he shouted, "Holy St. Patrick, insult an Irishman, will ye? I'll bust your bloody heads." He would have done it, too, if the mate had not come down just then to see what all the racket was about. There was one little island, Bocas del Torres, a key some 5 or 6 miles long, where we stopped for several days. It was covered with banana trees, palms, pawpaws, and guavas. The people fed us the best sweet potatoes I've ever eaten, and turtle meat from the turtles caught on the beach of the lagoon. The shells of these turtles were so large that some of the little black boys turned them upside down and used them for boats, paddling all about in the shallow water, sitting in the shell. The last day we were on the quay was a Sunday, and several of us went to church. The next day we made our departure and headed south for Pernambuco, Brazil. At Pernambuco almost every one was dark and spoke Portuguese. The ship's agent here was a busy, excitable little man. He had a great lot of freight to exchange for the goods we had aboard. He would say, "Jesus, caramba, caracoles," and hurry off down the deck. He and Uncle Silius talked together a great deal in the strange and beautiful language of Spain. In a day or two we made our departure. At Rio de Janeiro and at Santos we sent our freight ashore in lighters and took on coffee. I shall never forget the 5 weeks after our departure from Santos. After we had sailed, I did not know how many days. The days and nights became more chill. My uncle and the first mate were always talking about adjusting the compass. They figured many hours every day. We had been lightly dressed at Santos, but as we approached the Horn, it became colder and colder. The weather was consistently bad. Old Johnson began to keep the galley door closed. The ship was put in shape for rough weather. Extra lashing was used here and there. Hatches were seen too. Anxious eyes watched the foreboding heavens. It seemed as though the crew never rested. My uncle was on deck most of the time. He would come into the cabin, his oilskins dripping and his hands numb with cold, but after snatching a half-hour's rest, he would go on deck again. The ship was heavily loaded, and although normally she rode the waves like a gull, rising to each ominous gray mountain of water, and gliding gracefully into each valley, her cargo was so heavy that sometimes she would plow sullenly into an oncoming wave, flooding the decks with rushing water. I watched the angry sea through a porthole, and remembering bits from The Ancient Mariner, repeated to myself, with slopping masts and dipping prow, as who pursued with yell and blow, still treads the shadow of his foe, and forward bends his head. The ship drove fast, loud roared the blast, and southward we fled. I had known winter in Pennsylvania and in New England, but this was much colder. The bitter wind cut us to the bone. It seemed as though we had been transported into another world. This trackless waste of water was so different from anything I had ever known. The sun was always overshadowed, and the cold darkness hung about us like a veil hiding the past and the future. We dared not speak. We dared not even let our thoughts go astray. If we opened our mouths at all, it was to shout with a fearlessness we did not feel, as if the sound of fierce voices might subdue the elements where no amount of supplication would avail. Only once was there an interlude. On a day a little brighter than usual, we sighted the bare rocky coast of Tierra del Fuego. I was interested in this bleak land. There were birds that the sailors called Cape pigeons. Here, twice during the morning we saw an albatross. By noon the oppressing darkness had closed in about us. Each time we attempted to round the Horn, we were beaten back. The sea was running high, and the terrible cross currents, adverse waves, and pitiless wind made us fight for every inch of progress. We were almost stripped, but even the few sails we used were continually being reefed and furled. The sailors made their way up the ratlines laboriously and at great danger, as every inch of rigging was thick with ice. I would wake a half-dozen times in the night and hear the boatswain shouting, "All hands on deck ahoy!" and from far away the weary "Aye, aye, sir" of the crew, and I would crawl deeper into my heavy blankets, happy that I did not have to get out and work on the bitter cold deck, or climb out on icy rigging 50 feet above the rushing foaming sea, to furl or reef a sail. The first mate wanted to take advantage of the favorable winds and go east to the west coast of Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope. But my uncle was a determined man. He said we had started west, and west we would go. For 3 terrible weeks we tossed and pitched and beat about. At last, on our third attempt, we got around the Horn, and with great thanksgiving moved northward along the west coast of South America.